You are glorious beyond description. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my riches gain I count but lost, and more contempt on all my pride. Forbid, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my Lord. All the vain things that shun me most, I sacrifice them to His blood. See from His head, His hands, His feet, sorrow and love flowing down. Did such love and sorrow be, or thorns most so rich around? The whole realm of nature mine, that were present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, He blessed my soul, my life, my all. If you've got a Bible, you might want to turn to Genesis chapter 45. We'll eventually get there, and I'm not going to read all of the verses 1 to 11. I'm going to read them all, but I'm not going to put them all on the screen. That's what I meant to say. We've been looking at some selected Old Testament texts that tell of events in the Old Testament that are life-changing, sometimes world-changing, definitely faith-changing. And this one has been surfacing to my mind. And years ago we talked about this, but I wanted to bring it up again. It's the story of Joseph. And you probably heard that phrase before. If life gives you lemons, make punch, right? What is it?
Lemonade.
Oh, that's right. There's one thing that we all have in common, and that's something we have in common with the rest of mankind. And that is that we go through seasons where we have troubles, setbacks, tragedies, heartaches, injury, illness, betrayal, natural disaster, deep loss. That's just the lot of mankind, isn't it? We're not griping about it, we're not complaining about it, but it's the reality that there's some really rough parts in this life. And that means that sometimes we're handed a pile of bitter lemons. And what do you do with it? Sometimes our lament is the lament of Moses. He wrote a few of the Psalms, not many. But this one speaks what we feel at times. The length of our days is 70 years, or 80 if we have the strength, yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. Life is short, it is full of trouble, and then you die. That's what he's saying. Now, I don't want you to judge Psalm 90 by just that one verse. You ought to read the whole thing because it really comes out pretty well. But sometimes the troubles, the difficulties, the suffering, the sourness takes over. It puckers us up. It makes us bitter, especially if we forget where the real sweetness comes from. Sometimes we try to make our own sweetness. We think if we can make a lot of money and gather a lot of stuff, and then we buy into that old proverb that the difference between men and boys is the price of their toys. Women, I'm sure, don't do that. Or we find the perfect husband or wife, or boyfriend or girlfriend, the one that sweetens all of our life. The problem is we find out that they've got their own bucket of lemons as well to add to the mix. And then sometimes these relationships end in extreme bitterness. I mean, today I want you to remind you of a young man who it looks like had a charmed life. But he fell into the worst kind of trouble and suffering that any of us could imagine. And if we had found ourselves in the midst of it, I know we would have cried out and said, how could this have happened? What have I done to cause this? But I want you to see how he handles it. And so we're going to talk about the story of Joseph. He came from a complicated family background. And I'm not going to give you much detail about this, but it's good enough to read. Let me tell you that. His dad, Jacob, fell in love with this young woman and wanted to win her hand in marriage. And her uncle kind of played a game with him and sneaked her sister in on the wedding night, and he woke up the next morning finding out he had married the wrong woman. But the uncle had planned it that way because he wanted to marry both of them off. And so he finally ended up with the wife he wanted. And the problem was she was unable to have a child. And it was a big deal to have children. And the other one is really fertile. Leah has all kinds of babies, and even has babies through her handmaiden. And Rachel says, I need to have a child to represent me, to come from me. And so she did what was a common thing and gave her husband her handmaiden, and Of course, the handmaid immediately conceives. And then finally, God blesses Rachel with a child, and Joseph is born. She eventually has another one, Benjamin. But Joseph is really, really extra special. You know, he is the child from his favorite wife, the one that he fell in love with as a young man. And Joseph is unusually gifted. He's handsome, well-built, he's smart, he's precocious, and he was a snitch. You know, he's got all these brothers, and they're out herding the flocks and stuff, and when they misbehave, he tells his dad about it, and that doesn't make him real happy. And on top of that, Joseph has this gift from God. He gets these dreams, and they're prophetic dreams. And these two dreams, the first dream tells, essentially, it has Joseph's brothers bowing down to him. The second dream has Joseph's brothers and his father bowing down to him. Now, these were probably dreams he should have kept to himself, but he didn't. And so he told his brothers about it. And can you imagine how they felt about it? Well, they learned to hate this kid. He was a little brat, and he thought he was hot stuff, and he was a snitch. So one day, I think Dad, and sometimes dads are this way, I think he was kind of clueless about what was going on with these family dynamics and this sibling stuff. And he sends Joseph out by himself to check on his brothers who were over in Shechem, in a distant region, raising their flocks. And when they heard from people in the area that Joseph was on his way out, and so they had this conversation among themselves and say, here's our chance, we got to kill that brat. And one of the brothers, one of the older brothers, Reuben, intervened and said, you know, let's throw him into this empty well. Teach the kid a lesson. And so they do that. And then Reuben's away, and while he's away, some traders from Midian come by. And the other brothers said, hey, I know, let's do this. Let's sell him to those traders. And so that's what happens. Reuben comes back and he's, what? What happened to him? So what do they tell their father? Of course, Jacob had given Joseph, probably the best known thing about this story is that multicolored, that sport coat that was better than Liberace's. The coat of many colors. They kill the goat, they put some of the blood on the coat, they say, we found this coat. And Jacob immediately concludes his son was attacked by wild animals, by predators, and killed, eaten by animals. And the brothers don't tell him the truth. They let him believe that. And so Jacob grieves the death of his son. And also, he doesn't send anybody out to try to find his lost son, because he knows he's dead. In the meantime, you know what happens. Joseph is sold to these traders. The traders are going to Egypt. They sell him into Egypt into slavery. And an Egyptian nobleman named Potiphar buys him. So now he's a slave. He went from a privileged son of a wealthy man in Canaan, and now he is not a free man anymore, he's a slave. And so what does Joseph do? He becomes the best slave he can be. He works hard, he's trustworthy, he tries to honor God in all that he does. And God blesses him, and God blesses the household he's working for. And he helps his master to prosper, and his master is so impressed with this young man and trusts him so much, he essentially puts him in charge of everything in his household. And he has access to everything except, of course, from the man's wife. Well, she notices Joseph, and he's handsome. And she is drawn to him. She tries to seduce him. He resists. She tries to seduce him. He resists. One day, he rejects her. She is so angry with him, she runs to her husband and says that Joseph tried to rape her. And Potiphar immediately has him thrown in jail. Now, I've never been in one of those ancient Egyptian jails, but I can guess it's not very nice. And I'm going to guess that the state of Ohio doesn't come through and do inspections to make sure that the treatment is humane. So he's in a dungeon. Not because he's done something wrong, but because he did something right and wanted to honor God. And so what does Joseph do? He decides to become the best prisoner he can be. And I've skipped over a couple of scriptures here. Let me get to this next one. And here's what it says about Joseph. While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Are you seeing a pattern here? Chris Horwood had this phrase that he developed through his illness. He said, it's not how hard you can hit. It's whether you can get back up when you're hit hard. Wow. And he kept getting back up. And that's exactly what Joseph is doing. His brothers abandoned him. They are treacherous. His father thinks he's dead. But God never forsook Joseph. And you know something? I think Joseph knew that. He had that kind of a relationship with God, that even though all the external evidence was that God had turned his back on him, Joseph knew that wasn't true. And so he kept doing the right thing and trusting God and wanting to honor God by his life, no matter what was thrown at him. Well, before too long, it seems like his chance to get out of jail comes. The king's chief cupbearer and his chief baker both displeased the king, and so he has them thrown in jail. Nice guy. They both had dreams, and they were distressed because there wasn't anyone to interpret the dreams. And someone tells them about Joseph. And they said, we hear you can interpret dreams. And Joseph said, God is the one who interprets dreams. And he listens to their dreams and he tells them what they're about. He tells the cupbearer that this says that in 3 days, you're going to be restored to your position in the king's household. And to the baker, in 3 days, you're going to be executed. And he says to the cupbearer, when you are restored back to the king's household, please remember me and say something to the king, the Pharaoh, about me. So he doesn't forget that I'm here in prison. Well, sure enough, the cupbearer got his job back, the baker was killed, and the cupbearer promptly forgot Joseph. 2 years later, Joseph is still in jail. How many of us would have put up with that? How many of us would have said, Lord, is anybody listening to me? No, Joseph continued to be the best prisoner he could be, trustworthy. And then the Pharaoh, the king, has a couple of dreams. And he gets all of his chief advisors, and he gets his diviners, And none of his advisors can interpret the dreams. And the cupbearer says, uh-oh, I just remembered somebody. And he goes to the king and he says, sir, I know somebody that can help you with a dream understanding. And the king has Joseph sent for him. And there's a neat detail in the text because it says, Joseph shaved and put new clothes on. Now this gives me a little hint. I'm going to guess that they didn't give him new clothes every week to change into. And he wasn't able to take care of his personal grooming, which he seems to be the kind of guy that, would take good care of himself. And so he probably stunk, had skin rashes, so he cleans himself up, and he's brought before the king. And the king tells him the dreams, and Joseph knows what it means. Once again, Joseph said, it's God who interprets dreams. He always gives God the credit. He never says, you're lucky to have me because I am so wise and gifted. He never does that. He's got a humble view of himself. But he uses his gifts whenever God gives the opportunity. He says, King, there's a crisis coming upon your nation and upon the nations over the whole world. There are going to be 7 years of great harvest and prosperity, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine where no crops will grow. He said, I recommend that you start right now and you save 20% of all the grain that is grown. And you get ready for the time of famine. And look at what the Pharaoh says to Joseph. Things really are starting to get better now. Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. And so at the age of 30, Joseph is put in charge of Egypt's complete economic and agricultural system. Pharaoh tells him, I'm the king, but nothing is going to happen in this kingdom without your orders. Very few people can be trusted with that kind of power, by the way. But Joseph could be. And so this Hebrew slave, with a prison record, is given the hand of one of Pharaoh's daughters in marriage, lives in luxury, and rules over Egypt. What a remarkable turn of fortune. But that's not what this was about. This was not that Joseph had suffered so earlier on, and so God was rewarding him and blessing him. That's not what this was about. There was a much bigger picture that Joseph was a player in. And we start getting a view of that a little bit later, and especially now as we look back on it. You see, God had made a promise to Joseph's great-great-grandfather. He said to Abraham, Abram he was still called, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So this man, Abram, who was aging quickly, he said, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And Abraham doesn't have a child. And it's not until Abraham's close to 100 years old that his wife Sarah finally gives birth to the promised son, Isaac, who would help Abraham to be the father of a nation, which we learned would be Israel. But what's significant about this is it's not just a promise of a guy that you're going to have a great legacy, you're going to have a nation named after you, you're going to be the father of the nation. That's not what this is about. It's that one phrase. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. We know that this is the promise of the coming Messiah. We know that because of the fallen state of the earth, mankind is condemned to hell. We know that God loves us, that the statement in John 3:16 was true even back then. That God so loved the world that he was going to send his Son, that whoever believed in him would not perish, but have life forever. And he was using Joseph as an important link in this process. But the promise could never be fulfilled. All nations could not be blessed through Messiah, who came from the tribe of Judah, who came from Jacob and his sons. If Jacob and his sons and all their families starved to death during this worldwide famine. And so, a young man is presumed dead, ends up in slavery, goes to prison unfairly, so that he could rise to the most powerful position in Egypt and save that nation and save the surrounding nations from starvation, so that Judah could live and his descendants could live, and one day a virgin would conceive and bear a child and would call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. But I want to go back to Joseph's time, because what happens here is so cool. And how would you think about your brothers who had sold you to slavery and told your father that you were dead? Would there be any puckered soul from that? It would be real easy to have it, wouldn't it? That's extreme lemon. Well, the famine hits. The family of Jacob is getting hungry. He sends his sons to Egypt to buy grain. He doesn't send Benjamin. Benjamin is the other son of Rachel. Benjamin is the blood brother of Joseph. You can imagine, he's lost one of his sons of his favorite wife. He's not going to lose the other one, so he sends the other brothers to Egypt. And when they get to Egypt, they have to go before Joseph, because he's in charge of all the sales. He's directly in charge of all the sales to other countries. And they immediately bow before him. Remember the dream that Joseph had? It was fulfilled in every detail. Well, Joseph plays some psychological games with him. I don't think it's just that he's a rascal and that he's just trying to give them a hard time. I think he has to do some testing. He has to find out the men that they are now. I think in his heart, he simply wants to come run out and hug them all. But he's grown in wisdom and he knows human nature enough. After all, you never know. These guys might have killed him so that they wouldn't have to go home and say that, we lied, that our brother was still alive. And so he has to find out who they really are. And so he accuses them of being spies, saying, "Where did you guys come from that country for?" And they said, "We just came to buy grain when we were hungry." He said, "Yeah, I think you're spies." And they said, no, we're not. They tried to defend themselves, and they said, we've got to get this grain back to our father. And he said, are all of you here? They said, no, one of our brothers stayed behind, Benjamin. Joseph knew that. He said, I'll tell you what, we're going to hold one of you here until you bring Benjamin back. I'm going to see if you're honest men, if you're really telling the truth about it. In fact, you got another brother. And they're thinking, Father will never let us bring Benjamin back. And then Joseph lets the rest of them go, keeps Simeon, detains him. But he has his stewards put the silver that his brothers had paid to buy the grain, put the silver in the grain bags. And so when they get back to Canaan and they open up the bags, there's the money. Oh, they freaked out. These guys never wanted to have to go back and face this guy again. But when that grain ran out, they had to. And their father said, you're not taking Benjamin. And he said, they won't give us grain. We won't get Simeon back. And so Judah said, Father, I'll put my life on the line. If anything happens to Benjamin, you can kill my sons. Can you imagine a grandfather doing that? He said, I'll give my life. I'll give up what's most precious to me. That man took responsibility. And they go back to Egypt. And they brought Benjamin. Well, let me just fast forward. It all came to an amazing climax, a dramatic event. When, after Joseph had put the silver back in the grain bags again, and they were starting to head back to Egypt, or back home into Canaan, and Joseph had them stopped, and they found the king's silver cup in one of the bags. And in fact, it was in Benjamin's, of all people. So they were all brought back, and they must have been out of their minds, afraid of what was going to happen, dreading this. Judah steps up and begs Joseph to allow Benjamin to return, and offers himself in his place. And then God made sweetness out of Joseph's bitter experiences. And this is where I want to read to you as we're really drawing this to a close. It's Genesis 45, the first 11 verses. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified of his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt." And now, do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. Joseph knew what was going on. Somehow he was able to grasp that bigger picture. Joseph experienced nearly everything that you have. Betrayal, injustice, abuse. Often his situation was hopeless. But there was not one moment that God was not looking out for him. And God is not done with you. He loves you, and he has an important purpose for your life. Whether you can see that or grasp it or not, doesn't matter. God knows. Now, you say, but what is my part in this? You say, it doesn't matter if I don't know. That's right. Your part is to know that there is a God. To know that he is a fair and loving God, that he has your best interest in mind. That's your part, to know that, to grasp that with confidence, and to do the best you can to honor him, to do the right thing every time. That's what you can do. You say, what is my purpose in life? I can't find my purpose. Yes, your purpose is to do the right thing. It's to honor God. It's to be familiar with him, intimately familiar with him, and to learn from him, and to trust him through these situations, and to always do the right thing. That's what Jesus did for us. And look how it turned out for him. Well, along the way, it didn't look so good, did it? In that Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus was sweating blood out of distress because he knew what was coming. When he was being ridiculed and beaten, when he was being crucified, when folks were standing at the foot of the cross mocking him, it looked like everything had fallen apart. Just like in Joseph's experience, there was a purpose in it, and God wasn't done with him. Now, I can't say in the case of Jesus that God never forsook him, because he did. When he became sin for us, who, even though he knew no sin, so that we could become the righteousness of God. 2 Corinthians 5:21. And in those moments, he was forsaken, so that we wouldn't have to be. But then by the power of the resurrection, Jesus came forth, broke the bonds of death, and showed us that he truly is the Savior and that he has life for us. I don't care what life throws at you. You have a God that can help you overcome. So don't fear anything. Don't fear poor health. Don't fear old age. Don't fear natural disaster. Don't fear accidents and all the possible things that can happen, the kinds of things that you start dwelling on them that drives you crazy. Don't fear those things. You don't have to fear anything, because you've got a God that's more powerful than all those things. And if you're going through struggle and suffering right now, it's only temporary. It's just that you can't see the end of it. But God can. He sees the bigger picture. And he is not giving up on you. He loves you. Life is not for the weak. But I'll tell you what, as believers in Christ, we've got something that others don't have, that we want them to have. But we've got to live in this fullness and have total confidence in the God that is always there with us.
My eyes are dry, my faith is full, my heart is warm, my prayers are whole, and I know how I want to be alive. Give me your peace, O Lord.
Give me your peace, O Lord.
Safe in your dwelling.